My pastor's laughing at me because I have a running joke. We're going to go ahead and get started is what everybody says. And he catches himself saying it because he knows it's a pet peeve of mine. You did that this last Sunday.
No, I said if you were here.
Oh, that's right. My other pet peeve is if you're here today, and I always say, we're here today. You're like, if you're here today and you want to talk to somebody, how about if you want to talk to somebody? Because the people who hear you are there today, right? So he started saying it. If you're here this morning, and he looked right at me. I was like, oh, Jared doesn't like it. That's my job at my church, keeping everybody nervous. Okay. Brother, for how long it'll take, I have a word from my friend, Reverend Steve. He's from Australia. He's visiting with me today. He said it's going to take 10 years. So there's your answer from on high, or at least from down under. 10 years. 10 years. Okay. What we'll do in this final session is more practical. Those of you who've been itching for something that you can actually do, here you go, you little flesh yearning hearts. Something. No, this is actually directly taken from the book, actually, because one of the things I wanted to do with the Gospel-Driven Church is take, if you're somewhat familiar, maybe you haven't read it, but you're familiar with my book, The Prodigal Church, or the idea behind it. The Prodigal Church came out several years ago. It's published by Crossway, and it's largely critique, right? So most of it is essentially a critique of the attractional paradigm, step by step. So some of the questions that you may have about certain things, I've perhaps addressed more substantively either in that book or this one. But in that book, it's largely a critique, and there's like one chapter that's essentially, I think it's called The Way Forward, or a Way Forward. And so I had basically a chapter and a half in that book to kind of talk about, okay, what does it look like to now transition to gospel centrality? And my desire with that book was that it would get into the hands of lead guys, senior pastors, at attractional churches, that it would help them to kind of rethink. I tried to write the book in a very winsome, gentle way. I won't promise that it's perfect all the way through that, but I really did try to write it in such a way that's like I'm sitting across the table over coffee with somebody. The last thing that guys who I think should rethink their ecclesiology need is somebody yelling at them and condemning them and what have you. You just tune those people out, as we all do. Right? But if you believe somebody cares about you and they're just trying to reason with you from the Bible, that's what I try to do. As far as I can tell, in the 4 years or so since that book came out, it didn't quite land in those hands, but did land in hands of like guys in second and third chairs. So, often in those churches who have a dis-ease or an uneasiness with what has been taking place, but they didn't quite have the vocabulary. They didn't quite understand, like something's off. I feel like this isn't the right thing to do. But I don't know how to articulate that. And the Prodigal Church, what I discovered, kind of gave them some language or some ability to articulate some of the uneasiness that they had. But the next sort of ensuing question, as people, would sometimes bring me out to speak or do staff training days or what have you at their churches, is people were asking, okay, like I'm sold. I don't want to be attractional. I want to be gospel-centered. What do I do to do that? Like, how do I do that? And so that, for me, became the pressing need to write a book that sort of applied in more pastoral and practical ways the paradigm of gospel centrality, which is what the gospel-driven church is. Maybe you've already thumbed through it to some extent. I tell throughout the book a fictional story of a church, a guy transitioning his church from attractional to gospel-centered. And so I've tried to imagine some of the conflicts, tensions, challenges, conversations that would take place and that sort of thing. If you're familiar with Patrick Lencioni's leadership fables and some of his books, that's what I was shamelessly stealing, essentially, was a leadership fable about a guy changing his church. And so most of the chapters are half illustration through that story and then half here are some of the principles to work with. And towards the end of the book, I began talking about shepherding a transition in a gracious way. I have friends who are doing this. There are not many of them, but especially with large churches, essentially, how do you change a large church to gospel centrality without blowing it up? And that's what I want to talk about in this last session. And the key word in kind of the subtitle is the word shepherding the transition, because transition from attractional to gospel centrality has to be pastored as much as, if not more than, managed, right? So it's not about just creating a new set of programs and here's what we're doing now, people. You actually have to shepherd hearts through this transition. So it's vitally important that at the outset in these circumstances that your elders are qualified to be elders. that they are biblically qualified pastors, biblically qualified leaders, because in this kind of transition, in this kind of change, they're going to have to lean into those qualifications quite a bit. You begin to see kind of the testing of their mettle. We drift into programmatic mode so easily. We lean more heavily on our skills, on our education, on our gifts, probably more so than we ought to, forgetting that our abilities can never replace our character. Leadership skills and administrative aptitude will be advantageous in church change, like the one that I'm about to discuss, but a failure to be peaceable, a failure to be humble, a failure to be slow-tempered, those things will easily derail even the best skilled ministry manager. So I could say more on that, but let me just simplify in such a way to say this. What the church needs in every stage of congregational life, and especially in significant transitions, is a team of shepherds who will feed the flock. So here are some further keys. I'm going to try to go through them not super quickly, but somewhat quickly so that we can have time for questions as well at the end of this session. But these are 10 keys to shepherding a transition, leading change in a gracious way. The first is this: take it personally, but don't make it personal. Take it personally, but don't make it personal. Here's what I mean by that. To take it personally is simply to make sure that you have a real conviction that this change is needed. This simply can't be the next program that you want to try. I was in a church in Eastern Missouri and consulting with some elders about this whole deal. They'd read Prodigal Church. They wanted to know what insights would you have for our congregation, et cetera, et cetera. Meeting with the pastor, great guy, been in ministry a long time, just a veteran of good pastoral helmsmanship. And he brought me into his office, and I think I may even have used this example, not naming his name, but in the book. He brought me into his office, and he pointed at his bookshelves. And basically, he used the illustration. He said, these shelves it's like geological strata from the different eras of church growth, right? So, this shelf is sort of like from the 60s and then in the 70s and the 80s. And each era brought with it, this is what you do to get a whatever type church. And he said, Jared, the last thing I want is like the latest geological strata that in 10 years won't be it'll be something else. And gospel-centered is just whatever it was in the 2000s. And he said, I want to believe that what I'm about to do in sort of my last season of ministry, because he's probably about 10 years from retirement perhaps. In my last season of ministry is something that actually will last with the church. I don't want to end on just whatever the latest thing is. But for him, it couldn't just be the latest thing. It had to be a conviction. He needed to own the need for that change. So as you're working through something like this, do you actually understand the content that you're wanting to replace pragmatism with? Have you done your homework? Have you thought through multiple contingencies that could come up in a transition period? Is gospel centrality something you're convicted about doing and committed to seeing through? Or is it simply the latest ministry fascination or the need to, shake things up? You're just one of those leaders that you got to do a new campaign or a new thing because it just keeps people on their toes. You feel like maybe even that catalyzes growth if you just sort of keep people on their heels. I know pastors like that, and eventually they crash and burn, and their churches do as well. It has to be something that you've actually taken personally, but don't make it personal. In other words, don't tune your ups and downs to how people react, or to what ground is lost or made up, or to how the service is performing. It's very possible to make an idol of gospel centrality or to become legalistic about gospel centrality. This is just an interjection. If you have not read Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I highly recommend it. Of course, you'll find things in the book that you don't necessarily agree with, and there's things that Bonhoeffer believed that we don't necessarily agree with. But that book was so transformative to me in multiple places, and one of them was really in the conviction of not constantly measuring my church. He says, a congregation has not been entrusted to a pastor that he might become its accuser. So he said, you should never complain about your congregation, he says, which was very convicting to me as well. But essentially, always measuring people's gospel centrality, they're not gospel-centered enough, is a great way to not be gospel-centered with your church, right? That's being legalistic about gospel centrality. So it's incredibly possible to make an idol of it. Don't seek to change your church out of some strange projection or working out of your own gospel centrality, right? Here's Mark Sayers in his book, Facing Leviathan. He says, without realizing it, leaders can paint their own dysfunction over churches, ministries, and mission fields. All too easily, the effort to preach the gospel becomes about appeasing fears and insecurities, turning leadership into a tool used to primarily gain a sense of personal meaning. So some things are about you, for sure. Those of you who've pastored for a while, you know there's some things that they really are about you. But not everything that's about you is really even about you. You discover that as well if you dig deep with people in some kind of relational tension sometimes. Remember a lady that was very angry with me when I first got there, and I couldn't figure out why. I hadn't done anything wrong yet, right? I mean, I just showed up. But what I discovered was showing up was the wrong thing. And we were just always at odds, and it was always uneasy. She didn't say anything mean. It was just always tense, and her kids didn't like me, and I couldn't figure out what is happening in this situation. I could not, crack that code. And eventually what I discovered was this issue she had against me. She came and essentially asking for forgiveness. She came and said, it wasn't even about you. It was something that occurred during the search process, which of course the end result was me being hired. She didn't agree with certain things that were happening in the search process, which I didn't even know was occurring. It was not on the interview end, it was on the deliberation end. And she felt that the previous pastor wasn't given certain deferential treatment or something like that. But the end result of the process she didn't like was me. Therefore, I became the object of her scorn. And when she eventually felt tender and convicted about that, she came to me. And what I discovered was it wasn't even about me. I mean, it's about me, but it's about something deeper. And sometimes if you go deeper, you discover it's not really about you at all. So don't make things personal that don't need to be personal. And don't treat the church like your emotional support animal, okay? Secondly, practice the spiritual fruit of patience. Practice the spiritual fruit of patience. Give people time to process transition. Don't rush them. Generally speaking, people prefer to be led, not pushed. So hold as many hands as you need to, not to delay progress, but to ward off confusion about the progress. Because people understand at different rates. So remember that just moving forward is obedience. Don't assume that you aren't being faithful until you finally get there, wherever there is. Right? And don't remember also how patient God was with you before you got it. What was it that led you to gospel centrality? Somebody constantly and patiently with you, nitpicking all of the things you said and did and all the books you read? Is that what endeared you to gospel centrality? Probably not. So why would we do that with others? Don't treat others who are slow to grasp gospel-centeredness with the kind of pressure you were not subjected yourself. Rarely do people feel leveraged into a genuine comprehension of grace. So don't pester people through the change, be patient. Thirdly, move slowly and strategically. Move slowly and strategically. Right? Forward progress at a snail's pace is not ideal, but it's preferable to going backwards because you push too hard. So choose your shots. Don't try to do everything at once. Make incremental goals based on the congregation's ability to absorb the change. And then move as slowly as obedience will allow. Some churches change pretty fast. But most, and especially more established churches, will take more time. And this is just somewhat anecdotal. In my experience, and I'm generalizing here, the younger, both institutionally and demographically a church is, the more quickly it can change. The older, both institutionally and demographically a church is, the more slowly it can change or will change. Now, most of you already have experienced at least one end of that or the other, but there's all kinds of dynamics that can somewhat complicate those things as well. Sometimes the size of a church can have impact on that. Some large churches change very quickly, and it's because of how leadership is structured. Some large churches must change very slowly because of how leadership is structured. We did an interview with Clint Presley, who's pastor of Hickory Grove Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, and quite a character himself. But he's one of the few guys that I know who, and I'm not saying there's not more out there, but I know of maybe like two guys who have who are trying to transition an attractional megachurch to a gospel-centered church. And Clint is a guy who, he has the leadership mettle to do that because it's very difficult for him to get rattled. I very much admire and am envious of his ability to just, like, nobody scares him. And I'm like, what's that like, to never be scared, right? So that can actually go wrong sometimes, but in many cases it can actually go very right. But we did an interview with him for the church site. You can go check it out at ftc.co. You can search for Clint Presley in there. And essentially we asked him, how about leading change in a big church without blowing it up? Because he's a guy, despite his kind of man's man leadership type dynamic, he is very patiently, very pastorally just nudging this church forward and kind of leading it in a very gracious way. How do you do it without blowing it up? Presley said that leaders have to act like a little bit like barometers, gauging the congregation's what he called threshold of toleration for change. And he says that the pastor has to take care to keep the church moving forward, but always keeping them at the threshold of tolerance, not going too far, okay? You can check out that video, see more about him at ftc.co. Fourthly, show meekness and give mercy. Show meekness and give mercy. So when conflict arises, as it very often can in the midst of significant change, it's very easy to slip into a self-justification mode, right? But gracious pastors constantly repent of defensiveness and constantly stay on guard against becoming domineering, which is something Peter says pastors cannot be in 1 Peter chapter 5. One way that I've learned personally to work against handling conflict sinfully is to, in many ways, mentally advocate for my critics or complainers. It always hurts my feeling when someone criticizes me or complains about me, but I try to get beneath that and think, what's motivating this, right? Like, so what if it's really not about you? What if they're just taking something out on you? And it doesn't make it right, but it can help you respond in a gracious way if you begin to look at perhaps motivation, right? Maybe this person's going through some really difficult things in their life. Those of you who have older members in your church who are traditionally resistant to change or slow to change. So having pastored older folks, I began to see, okay, for them, it's not so much that they're opposed to what you're trying to do, it's that the entire world is changing. And it's changing so fast. And church is often the only place that is a place of comfort and familiarity, and so they feel secure there. And so if they now come to church and it's changing like crazy, what's happening? Everything's changing. They feel disoriented. Now, you may not resonate with that, but I think the older you get, the more you will, right? So again, I'm not an old person, but I'm getting older. And the older I get, I begin to experience the world differently and realize it's less and less oriented around me. It's more and more oriented around youth, which I used to enjoy quite a bit. It catered to my taste as a young person. It was centered on me as a young person. Now that's dysfunctional and idolatrous in and of itself. But if you just feel like the world is changing and you don't understand it, now coming to church and it's changing so fast and you don't understand it, imagine the discombobulation and disorientation that can result in that. So to move slowly with those members, to help them have buy-in, to make sure that they understand, to make sure that they're part of it. It's not happening to you, but we're doing this together. And so we all want to be, sort of linked arms, including you, older brothers and sisters. So sometimes the anger that is being espoused is the root is insecurity or it's fear, right? It's not really about you. Now, sin is sin, of course, and pastors have to address actually divisive, short-tempered, gossipy, or otherwise quarrelsome people. But a lot of conflict could be headed off at the pass if we learn to be slow to speak, quick to listen, reluctant to engage in unfruitful back and forth with people. If we make it, our practice to forgive people in our heart, to give them mercy by not always feeling the need to fight back. This is something that Ronnie Floyd writes in his entry in Dr. Allen's Portraits of a Pastor. He says, as pastors, we can get into trouble when we choose to die on the wrong hills. The greatest leadership lesson I have learned is that not every hill is worth dying on. There are definitely hills that we must be willing to die on, hills where we do not give 1 inch. Some of those include key doctrines like the authority of Scripture, morals that violate Christ's teaching, and ethics that harm our testimony. And there are others, but these are some of the bigger hills where we need to stake our flag. Dying on secondary hills is unwise. When you die on every hill, when you have the need to be right or feel you must have the last word on everything continually, you're setting yourself up to forfeit your leadership. So embracing meekness keeps us from treating every meeting as a battle or every conversation like a conflict. If you die to yourself, you don't need to die on every hill. Now, there may very well be battles to fight, but remember that people are not the enemy. Prepare for spiritual warfare, but don't spiritualize every conflict, right? The person who is opposing you is not necessarily demon-possessed. That's what I'm trying to say. So don't make opposite sides of an issue related to transition about good versus evil. I'm the good guy and you've got to be the bad guy, because they invariably see it the other way around. If there is sin, address it. But remember that just because somebody disagrees with you or doesn't understand doesn't mean that they're in sin. Zach Eswine, in his book, Sensing Jesus, says, know-it-alls will almost always identify negative reactions to their decisions as the cost of standing for the truth and suffering for the Lord. But leaders may not realize they can wrongly wound people with the right thing. The right thing done the wrong way demonstrates a lack of pastoral wisdom and care. Number 5, employ plurality and embrace parity. Embrace parity. Now, for some of you, this will be easier than others, depending on your polity in your church, your leadership structure, your governance. But whatever it is, it's important to present a united front with your fellow leaders. Right? The more leadership is unified in a transition, the less opportunity there is for anyone to say, oh, this is just Pastor so-and-so's idea. No, you can say it's actually God's idea, and we are agreed as your pastors or as your leaders that we all want to make sure that we adopt it. So in leadership discussions and deliberations, also make sure that even the pastor who may be considered the first among equals isn't just dictating their own vision. Pursue true parity within levels of leadership. Every qualified pastor ought to have an equal say in how the vision gets implemented, even if there is just one pastor who is essentially leading the point position of leadership or doing the bulk of communication to the church. The wider among the leadership the vision is applied and the more consensus there seems to be, the more convincing the vision for change will be to the congregation. When I was establishing elders at my last church, because I believe that was the biblical pattern, I didn't simply show up and say, guys, y'all are in violation of the Bible. You're supposed to have elders. What I did was like, who are the leaders who are here? And that was we had a deacon board, right? And so I took a year with my deacon board, just gently suggesting and then eventually reading a book with them and then another book with them. So now the deacons are on board. Hey, we actually need elders in this church. We're not, accurately reflecting the biblical pattern for church governance. So now I've got the existing leaders on board. So now when I'm introducing it to the congregation, it's not, well, here goes Pastor Jared off on this thing, but no, it's actually, he's got the deacons who are now agreeing to this, and they're also our leaders. And I took a year to just patiently work through with the congregation before we were able to bring it to a vote. So it took me in total 3 years to transition our church into adopting a plurality of pastors. But I had to get those first leaders on board first. 6, over-communicate. Over-communicate. Do not assume that vision casting is a one-and-done deal. Communicate what you're doing, where you're going, how you're getting there, and especially why you're doing it, and then don't stop. Over-communicate. Then re-over-communicate. Then re-over-communicate again. Tom Rainer says, I have never seen or heard a major change initiative and its accompanying vision repeated too much. And here's why, okay? It may, like to you, this may feel like overkill. Like, why don't they get it yet? So what could be compelling and settled in your mind is likely that way after weeks and weeks and months of deliberation and study and prayer and collaboration with other leaders. Your congregation has not had that advantage. I know this sometimes pains you, but your church generally isn't thinking about the church every day of their week. We wish that they would, but even if they were making efforts, they couldn't do that like you could. And they don't need to do that like you do. If you're the leader, if you're the pastor, every day you're thinking about your church, about what needs to change here and what needs to change there, what you'd like to see. It's always on your mind, dwelling there. For most of your people, they begin thinking about that in anticipation of Sunday morning. So to expect that Sunday morning exposure to equate to what you every day dwell in and look at and study and research and write about and listen to podcasts about and look at blogs about and all of those sorts of things, to think that they're suddenly going to get it and having an equal amount of exposure to it is just unfair. What will feel old to you will feel brand new to them. And even your enthusiasm about it at first could unsettle them. But as they wrestle through comprehension, they're going to begin to feel the pressure of your excitement pushing them to process more quickly than many times they feel able to process. In their book, Leading Congregational Change, it's co-authored by three fellows, Jim Harrington, Mike Bonham, and James Furr. The authors say this: in the excitement to announce the vision and begin implementation, change leaders often forget that the rest of the congregation has not been a part of the intense dialogue and soul searching that are a part of discerning and articulating the vision. In forgetting this key fact, they underestimate the amount of communication that will be required. To expect commitment from the congregation without adequate interaction and understanding is unrealistic. Now, I remember this lesson being learned by me when myself, elders, and the deacons at my last church were presenting the church budget. And when we first began presenting the church budget, and questions come up in the membership meeting about this line or that line and why we do this and why we do that, and leaders are getting frustrated. Well, why are they getting frustrated? Well, I mean, you put us in this position to make these decisions. Why don't you trust us? Well, I mean, that's a valid sort of objection, but you also have to understand that if the first time someone sees the budget is at that meeting, they're not thinking about all the times you guys worked through all these questions, had all this processing, back and forth, tying up every loose end. You might have even anticipated those questions in your meetings, but they don't know that. We're frustrated with them because they're in a moment having to process what we've taken months to process to get this budget produced. People want to know how those numbers are arrived at. And it felt to me at first constantly like they're second guessing me or second guessing the deacons. They want to demand for justification. And I felt this constant nitpick of questions was essentially distrust of all of our leaders. And there were times where I wanted to say, look, if you don't trust us to make sound decisions, don't elect these people to be your leaders, right? That's what I wanted to say. What good is it to form a committee to make decisions that you're then going to rhetorically undermine every year at budget time? So what finally occurred to me was that the folks asking the question simply didn't have the advantage of the time and investment enjoyed by leadership. So what we started giving the budget draft out a month in advance, which meant we had to work even harder and earlier in our schedule to produce something that people could have 4 weeks to examine themselves. And then we said, if you have any questions about this, let us know. And then guess what happened? Within a month, you get to the meeting, the questions were greatly reduced. Somebody would call, send an email. Hey, I just have a question about this. Oh, thanks. Here's the answer to that. Oh, yeah, that sounds right. And so it's not feeding into that leadership time. The vision that is so clear in your mind from countless hours contemplating it for your job will not be so clear in the congregation, who will mostly think about it only when you bring it up. So you'll need to over-communicate. When you feel like you've said too much, you're probably arriving at the right amount. 7, show your cards. Show your cards. I hate movies and television shows that rely on misunderstandings that could easily be avoided with a simple answered question. Anyone remember, this is going to date me, anyone remember the old 80s TV show Three's Company? Okay. Are we okay to talk about it now? Because there was a time like you couldn't bring up Three's Company in church because it was so, compared to stuff that's on TV now, like it's super tame, Three's Company. But there was a time like you wouldn't admit that you watched it. But in any event, Three's Company, every episode revolved around a stupid misunderstanding birthed by lazy screenwriting in my mind, right? Somebody's overhearing a phone call and they only hear one side of it, and then they freak out about what they think they heard, and then the entire episode revolves around hijinks related to the misunderstanding that then gets solved at the end. No, it was all about this, and oh, okay, and everything is solved. In real life, that doesn't happen, right? Or at least it shouldn't, and usually doesn't. Maybe it's also in a lot of romantic comedies, right? So you're approaching the latter third of the movie, and the woman sees the guy that she's been dating, and he kisses this girl outside his apartment. It's like, who's that? And she storms off, and then he goes to talk to her. Why are you so angry? And she won't say. Like, why would you not say? Well, because you need 20 more minutes of movie. That's why, right? They got to walk around the park. They got to have a musical montage, all this sort of thing. When it would be totally solved if you saw it and ran up. What are you doing? Oh, this is my sister. Oh, okay. And it's all solved, right? But you couldn't have a tension in a movie if that happened, right? In real life, that doesn't typically happen because we ask the person that we overhear clarifying questions. Hey, who were you talking to? What was that about? Right? The same can happen in churches when we just make assumptions without asking questions. So show your cards, reveal to people your motivations for things, demonstrate how you're getting to where you're getting. Ask clarifying questions, let them ask clarifying questions. Tell people how long this might take. Be as honest as you can about the process. Tell them what you're worried about, what you're excited about, what you're afraid of, what you're in need of. Don't let them have to make assumptions about what's going on. It's just going to add tension and conflict to the whole transition. Number 8, operate consistently. Operate consistently. One of the few things more maddening than impotent leadership is inconsistent leadership. Is your willingness to apply the necessary changes in your church erratic? Oh yeah, we got to talk about this gospel-centered stuff right now. Or do you vacillate between excitement and apathy? Does the communication of the vision for gospel centrality hinge on the times when you're feeling extra gospel-y, in other words, right? How about your implementation of change within the congregation? Are you biased as it pertains to augmenting or eliminating certain programs? These will be easier because there'll be less conflict with these people, so we'll change all their stuff. But we'll wait, we'll be passive with these folks. Do you pick and choose based on easiness or timidity or maybe even nepotism? If so, what you're telling people is that you're really hyped for gospel centrality so long as it's easy to implement. You're communicating that it's not worth having hard conversations about or risking conflict over. That it's not important enough to do the right thing across the board about it. So take the example of reducing programs. Maybe you've determined that this change that you're making necessitates the discontinuing of a set of church programs that do not serve the vision. This is always really, not always, it's frequently difficult because for every program, especially long-standing program, there's a heart attached to it. Especially if you got a dear heart who's been leading that program for a long time. Because you're not killing the program, you're killing that person, right? Or at least that's how it feels, right? You're putting that person down, essentially, right? So some pastors will come in and they'll just cut the program that are easiest to cut and let others with strong personalities involved or more tender personalities perhaps hang around. Why? Because the pastor doesn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And they don't want to run afoul perhaps of certain power structures in the church. But what he's really communicated is that gospel centrality isn't worth being consistent about. He's let some people off the hook, but not others. And letting people off the hook is actually putting others onto it. So apply across the board. Many times doing this feels like not giving grace to people you're trying to bring in line. But by failing to do this, you're not showing grace to the others who are in line. Because you expect them to meet higher standards than others. And in some cases, you can tempt them even to envy, or you can tempt them to bitterness about those who were let off the hook. Or maybe even superiority. We're the ones who are actually gospel-centered, The gospel eventually brings justice at all levels, including to the teensy-weensy level of church programming, where some folks just want to keep their Sunday school class just the way it is, thank you. This is the way we've always done it. It's a gracious thing to everyone to be consistent. Again, Rayner says, we don't lead change for change's sake. We lead change for the sake of the gospel. This is also true if you're always changing, right? Consistency in seeing gospel centrality through is key, and it's key to understand that you will never, ever, ever be through with gospel centrality. So this isn't a church growth model. It's God's biblical design for the church, period. Which isn't to say that there aren't other things that change as cultural challenges shift, as neighborhoods see changes in demographics, contexts take new forms. The same old message may require new missional wineskins. But the gospel must not be the latest strategy for growth. It must be the only strategy. Number 9, cheer people on and celebrate wins. Cheer people on and celebrate wins. If you're taking notes, congratulations, you're writing like one of the chapters in the book. So, keep on if you'd like. But it's all written there in the book that you have. It's possible to, these guys really like that. I don't know. Cheer people on and celebrate wins. It's possible to lead a transition to gospel centrality in a law-centered way, which I spoke about earlier. And this will embed an internal defeater in the movement. right? So how can you make sure people don't get burnt out on, quote unquote, trying to be gospel-centered? Create a culture of encouragement. Be your team and your church's lead cheerleader, in other words. Make a big deal out of every success and positive adjustment along the way. Thank people. Honor people. Bring people into the fold of acknowledgement and celebration. Help them to feel like they belong. That change isn't just happening to them, but also by them and with them. Don't just be a barometer for change, be a thermostat for optimism, setting the tone to joy for your church. It's a joyful thing to focus more deliberately on Christ and his glory, isn't it? So go first in that endeavor and set the example. All right, finally, number 10, keep preaching the gospel. You knew I would end there. Keep preaching the gospel. Gospel truth, lovingly and consistently applied, Ray Ortlund says, creates a gospel culture. Do not grow faint in that good endeavor. Don't just over-communicate the vision for gospel centrality, over-communicate the message of the gospel. The vision of Christ's glory proclaimed in the gospel of his finished work, in the end, is not simply the change of a church model, but the change of a church heart. And the only message that can empower a changed heart is the good news. So preach grace and grace alone, and don't give up. And then watch. Watch as the metrics of grace emerge to become the measurement of your church's health over time. Preaching the gospel is the first and most important way to give your church the power it needs to bear fruit in Christ. A gospel-driven pastor is really the first key to a gospel-driven church. Okay, that's what I have. We have until 2, yes? Theoretically? 1:40. Okay, 1:40. So if anyone has questions, we can... There's a question over here. Oh, there's a question here. Take your pick.
Hi there. Most of the epistles were Paul writing to, the churches and either admonishing or encouraging them in what they had been doing. And it seems like what I see most of the time, and not particularly in my church, but say social media, is the showing and highlighting all the faults of the church and not a whole lot of the successes. In the context of pastoral, preaching, how can the pastor do in a Pauline fashion to the congregation to encourage them with, what other churches are doing instead of just their own little circle, but more like the Catholic Church, what's going on globally, instead of just like focused on their own little speck of land. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so letting your church know about the growth of other churches, that sort of thing, to share to not see other churches as... Yeah,
but, like a healthy way of, Paul had a lot of criticisms about other churches, or, but also a lot of encouragement about what they were doing correct. And I just don't see a lot of that going on, except, from a teaching perspective, go read books about what's going on in the global church. Right. But how do they do that from the pulpit without... getting on social, brought onto TV saying, hey, this pastor is dogging on another church.
Yeah. I think there's a variety of ways that you could facilitate that. If you're looking sort of globally, I think it's becoming increasingly important for more than that reason for the church in the West, particularly the church in the United States, to remember not just the suffering and persecution of our brothers and sisters in the global church, but also the things they could teach us about doing Christianity in places where Christianity is not a dominant culture. We're rapidly approaching that. And some places in the United States, it's already there. But as we become a more secularized country, we have to stop. We should have before this, but we have to stop thinking of ourselves as the center of Christianity or the center of Christendom. And most Western Christians already think that way. We're the enlightened ones, we're the, what have you. So I think as many examples as we can use, perhaps in sermons, maybe there's different elements that you could incorporate. I think locally or regionally, something that's important to do is to create a good fraternity among pastors in the area. So I come from a place, I was telling my friend Steve yesterday, I come from a region where pastors of other churches didn't tend to fraternize with each other because your churches are competition. That guy's got the market share that you want. And so you don't celebrate that guy's success because his success is your loss, right? And I don't see that as much here in Kansas City, thank God. I mean, I'm not saying that there's not a problem, that problem is completely, impossible here. But I see much more fellowship between pastors of different churches. I see much more celebration of the good things that are happening in each other's churches. I think that kind of thing can be, for lack of a better word, contagious to a congregation. But I think perhaps even one thing that we did at our church in Middletown is because it's such a dry area and there weren't a lot. So whenever a church plant would come to the area, so after a while, when I first went to Middletown, which is a town of about 600, 700 people, around us, there's all these little towns, and there was no gospel witness in most of those places, no gospel preaching churches. After a while, New England's like on the radar. And so in just the 6 short years I was there, NAM began putting church plants in all these towns around us. And the people in our church didn't know what to think of that. Because first of all, church planting is a weird new thing. They hadn't, like, when I'm talking about us planting a church, they're like, oh, they're like freaking out. So I had to be really slow about that. But they don't know what to think about someone else coming and doing a church. What if we lose people? What if we whatever? I said, why aren't we glad? Like, can we reach everyone in our area? So when a new church planter's coming, I want to go out to coffee with him, get to know him, see what he's doing. I want to talk about him in my church. There were a couple times, because I knew the guy pretty well and had kind of established relationship with him, that I was even willing to say, if anyone's interested in helping, plant in Poultney that doesn't have a church, I'd be glad to talk with you about that, and you would have my blessing to talk with this pastor about that. That's a radical way to be generous with your people, but also just having them in the building, giving them a love gift. There's things that you can do to kind of generate goodwill in your church about the churches in your area. I don't know if that totally answers the question, but it's an approach. There was a question over here. Yes, sir.
As you're thinking about men who are leaders in the second chair, are there any particular direction or anything you would give us as we think about this material?
Yeah, so I'm not going to ask you about your context, but it probably depends on what kind of church you're in. So if you're in a second chair in a church where you don't agree with the direction of the church or the vision of the church, I would say, first of all, to remember that humility speaks a lot more loudly than pressure, trying to evangelize for gospel centrality or whatever it is. Something I heard Matt Chandler say quite a bit ago in response to this question, which is essentially, if you're not in the lead chair, you're not the one setting the vision. And so just think about it. I know gospel centrality is better than not, but imagine you had a guy in your second chair who didn't agree with gospel centrality. And so he was constantly trying to get you to change your mind about the direction of the church, and constantly, right? So in your mind, he's wrong, and he's not in the position to be trying to tell you what to do. Now, he might be able to influence your thinking on those things in certain ways. But if you're in a second chair and you're not the one able to set a vision for gospel centrality, I understand the unease of that, but I think I would just remember to learn what you can, to be faithful and patient and humble, and serve to the best of your ability. Learn what you can in that context. But also, just, I don't mean it as a harsh word, it's not likely that a church will change. So I've seen a lot of guys like, I'm just waiting for the church to change, and it's likely not going to unless the pastor has a change of vision or change of heart himself. So learn what you can until it's time to move to a place where you feel like better reflects the biblical portrait. A question over here. Oh, yes, sir.
You spoke about taking 3 years to make that transition to a plurality of elders, and that you worked through a couple books with those deacons. Would you be willing to share what those books were? Yeah,
there was 9 Mark stuff. One of them was Thabiti Anyabuile's Finding Faithful Elders and Deacons. The other one was the little, is it called Building Healthy Churches or Growing Healthy Churches? The colored book on elders, which is by Jeremy Rennie. We use those couple of things. And I find them helpful. So the crew that I had, if I'd handed them some big, polity thing, they just, you're crazy, right? So those are short books. They're very practical. They're very clear. And for those who wanted more, they could go deeper. But for most of my folks, this is just laying out. This is what it says in Scripture and what have you. If you have people who believe the Bible, right, and you're patient with them, if they really believe the Bible, they're going to get there. You just reason, with them using the Bible. Because who wants to go against the Bible? Right? Well, some people do, and you've encountered those people. I hear from people, I don't care what that book says, Pastor. We're going to, well, that person's probably not a Christian, right? So, yes, sir, right here.
Yeah. So I've been going to my church like 2.5 years straight. I was saved about 2.5 years ago, and I've heard it's a lot about grace, and stuff like that. About 3 weeks ago, our pastor got up, started talking about homosexuality, and a lady got up and walked out. One of my friends texted me, was like, "What'd you think about that?" I believe God's called me to pastor now, so I know you're supposed to preach what the Bible says and talk about it. But the guy who messaged me was like, it's God's love that saves us. You know what I mean? And so I would just like to get your view on that. Like, okay. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I didn't hear the message.
I'm saying he just that.
So he was saying homosexuality is a sin.
Yeah, but that hasn't been talked about in our church. It's more grace, and there's a lot of people recovering from drugs and stuff like that. And he just busted out with it out of nowhere. And it kind of offended people, I think. But I mean, how would you go about that? Is that the right way to do it? I don't know. I wonder about these things.
Well, again, not hearing and not knowing your church, I hesitate to say anything categorically about it. So I will say this. People who are not familiar, they haven't been discipled to read the Word of God well, are often surprised when someone says something that's in the Word of God. And so to create for your church a love for the Word of God is essentially to expose them to the whole counsel of it, which includes which things are sins, which things are not sins, how we get out of sin, all those sorts of things. I'll also just say that talking about grace, we're all about grace. If you don't mention sin, then grace is just an abstract, ethereal sentimentality, right? The grace exists because sin exists. The grace redeems us. I mean, and even to go further, grace is not a detached, disembodied, ethereal virtue. It's not, this is something Sinclair Ferguson says. He says, it's not as if Christ died to give us a thing called grace. He died to give us himself. He says, grace is Christ. Or as John Calvin says, grace is Christ clothed in the gospel. So it wasn't a thing that was crucified to give us a thing called grace. This is still Ferguson, by the way, if you think I'm really brilliant. This is Sinclair Ferguson. He said, it wasn't a thing that was crucified to give us a thing called grace. It was Christ himself who was crucified, that he might give us himself. So to always be talking about grace doesn't really solve even the problem of how people come out of sin. Because if you're not talking about what Christ died for, which is to take the punishment for our sin. So that can be very jarring. Even if you're talking about grace, I thought we were about grace, now you're talking about sin. It's impossible to talk about biblical grace without talking about what the law announces about our status before God apart from Christ. So I'm not saying that as any kind of, I didn't hear the sermon. It could have been good. I don't know. I don't know your friend's total concern about it. I would say the most loving thing that you could do for someone who's going to hell is to tell them that they're going to hell. And you need to do that in a condemnatory way. There's ungracious ways to do that, but it's not a lack of love to tell people what the fundamental problem they have is, which is that we stand guilty before a holy God. And grace is actually the intervening salvation for that. Christ laid himself down essentially to be the propitiation for our sin. And that's the most loving message that you could share with anybody. But that's not to say that there are ways of preaching about the sin of homosexuality which are very graceless. There's no doubt about that. When we elevate it as if that's really the worst sin or the only sin, or that if you sin differently than me, then you must be a bigger sinner than me. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to mess up the preaching of sin, but by itself, the preaching of sin is not graceless. Because, if you went to a doctor and you had cancer, would you want him to, not tell you? No, I want to know what the problem is so we can actually address it and save my life. So it may not feel tender in the moment to hear what the real problem is, but if my real problem is sin, I have to hear that whether I like it or not. And again, I don't know all the dynamics, why that woman left. She might have been going to the bathroom, brother. You don't know. I used to think people were walking out on me, I thought they were leaving because I said something, and it was something else entirely. So I don't want to assume anything about that situation. Yeah. We have time for a couple more questions. Oh, yes, sir, right here. I'm sorry.
I was cautioned when I started at my current church, an established church, an older congregation, older demographic, to not make any major changes within the first year.
Yeah.
And so I preached the gospel, and I love the people, and I did change the coffee from horrible coffee to better coffee.
Okay.
And that about blew things up. I mean, even incremental change in an established church is enough to make things explode, it seems. And now I'm almost 9 years in, right at 9 years, and we've made some changes along the way, but to make a change on this scale, not that we're attractional by any means, but to shift our whole paradigm, I think it might seem disingenuous, like, where in the world did this guy come from?
Yeah.
I'm kind of part of the status quo at the moment. We've been going along this way for 9 years, and now he wants to turn it on its head. I mean, how do I... in addition to repenting for my lack of leadership, how do I shepherd that transition?
Yeah. So you've changed the game on them, essentially. You were good in the first year of knowing, but then you just sort of kept that, this does not push things too far. So in the book, in the story, the worship leader struggles the most with this guy wanting to change the church, and it's essentially because he doesn't have buy-in, and it's changing the whole... it changes the music content, all those sorts of things. And one of the things the guy says is essentially like, you change the rules. And we've been working together well for the last however long. And now all of a sudden you have a change of heart, and I don't have a change philosophy, and now you're wanting me to adapt to you. So that's what you're feeling, is essentially you've led them to believe this is how it's going to be. And I don't know your church again, so I can't speak to its personality or temperament or what have you. But if you've been content to essentially be the chaplain to their spirituality, it will feel like a jarring thing. And so it may be another 9, 10 years, I don't know. So the first thing to change is the preaching, if you haven't already. Gospel-centered expository sermons, which, you should probably do some study on that if you haven't already. I don't want to assume that you haven't. But changing what comes from the pulpit is the primary place. The reason not every, but most churches, including attractional churches, prioritize a teaching time is because we really do believe a guy standing up and talking for 20 to 45 minutes or whatever it is actually changes things or affects things. Why do we believe that? I believe it does, but it doesn't usually happen in one sermon. For most people, it's not. For some people, there is. That was the sermon where I saw the light or what have you. But for a congregation, it's typically not a lifetime, but a long time. You're just chipping away at this block of marble, trying to get to that portrait that's in there, that sculpture that's in there. And it may take a long time to do that. So you've changed the rules on them. So I'd be really patient, but just start preaching the gospel, because when people's hearts are tuned to the gospel, they'll start feeling unease with the status quo themselves. So it's one thing to be saying, don't you feel that? They probably don't. But if they're one to the gospel, they'll start looking around going, gosh, I'm not engaged with my neighbors as much, or whatever it is, because the gospel really does change those things. Yeah.
So I do youth ministry, and one of the things that I've learned doing youth ministry is that it's one of the most constantly changing bases of ministry that you can be in, not in content, obviously, the gospel, but in audience. Your students are always changing. I've seen 3 generations, 6th grade to seniors, come in and out of our youth group. So we've talked about a lot, like what this looks like applying it to a church, a gospel-driven church. What does a gospel-driven youth ministry look like?
It's in the book, man. I'll give you a summary. So this is just based on my anecdotal experience. Typically in the churches, it's the youth and children's leaders who are the quickest to come on board. And I position the youth guy in my book as essentially having the most difficult job in terms of people to please in that context. It's not true in every church, but in a lot of churches, the youth guy has the most difficult job, because not only does he have to do what the leadership's telling him to do, but he has the expectation of all these parents whose idols he's babysitting every week. And when the idol doesn't want to go to youth group, guess whose fault that is? Right? So in terms of methodology, right, it depends on your context or what have you. Some people think if you're gospel-centered, like, you don't do games, you don't have fun, you can't have fun, that sort of thing. No, that's not what gospel centrality teaches. But what we're aimed at primarily is discipling and relational engagement. One of the things that I think that the church I'm a member of does well, and that our church in Vermont actually did pretty well, is facilitating as much intergenerational connection with the youth in the larger church. Because in so many churches, not just attractional churches, but in so many churches, youth group becomes its own sort of ghetto within the deal, right? And we're looking at this young adult dropout rate going, why is this happening? 70%, I don't know if it's still that high, but 70% of young adults drop out of the church once they graduate. Well, we've created this whole church for them, aimed right at them, that's youth oriented. Well, guess what? When they graduate from that, completely detached from the life of the congregation, church isn't for them anymore. And that's why I think, in fact, a lot of attractional stuff, it's beginning to look more and more like youth ministry, right? We got, mascots dunking basketballs on the stage. That happened this past week at a pretty large attractional church. I'm thinking, where did that come from? Well, that looked like my youth ministry in the 90s, It's a fun and games. We just got to keep extending youth group to keep people excited and happy. So discipleship, intergeneration, as much as you can facilitate intergenerational engagement and your students actually participating in the congregation. I have a 17-year-old daughter. She volunteers with the AV team. So like every third week or so, she's running sound or what have you in the worship service. And that's a little thing, but it makes her she's a part of the church. She serves the church. She's not waiting to serve the church as some potential congregational member, that sort of thing. So I think facilitate those things, and then just philosophically, especially if you have good pastors who support you and have your back. That was the thing. I hated student ministry when I was in it. I knew I wasn't called to do it, and that's why I know it's difficult. But when I became a pastor and had student ministers, unless he's in sin or did something really stupid, I've got his back. And I may even disagree with the decision he made, but if it's not sin or stupid, I got his back. So if a parent's mad, send him to me, and I will say, look, he's the guy over this, and we're not going to agree with all his decisions. Is your kid dead? Are they hurt? Are they if there's if the answer is all that's no, what are we trying to make his job harder for? So just own that people aren't always going to enjoy it. Discipleship and congregational life isn't what sells in student ministry, but I think that's what makes for a healthier and more mature church down the road. I think we have time for one more. Yeah. Who we got? Oh man, we're gonna have to arm wrestle. We got lots of. We'll go with this brother over here, sitting all by himself. Brother, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, well, this is a dangerous question.
Okay.
So this is dealing more with the global church.
With a what church?
Global, rather
okay.
than a single church. So maybe beyond the scope of this discussion. But first thing we said this morning was about the acts of the flesh being dissension and factions. And so we all agree about the importance of gospel-centered. And yet, even within Baptist life, we have multiple factions and dissensions that just seem to go beyond where we ought to be going. Any thoughts about that? How we ought to be dealing with it, or how?
Factions and dissensions in the global church.
Well, within the Baptists.
Oh,
we have 114 kinds of Baptists.
All right.
A lot of times we won't fellowship with each other.
Yeah, you're right. Oh, brother. Let me say something that's not tweetable. That's my aim in the next 90 seconds. That's right. Please attend. If you're going to TGC, attend Dr. Allen's denominational denomination. So the things that theoretically or institutionally divide us, we could say institutionally divide us, can be signs of good health, right? I find it remarkable that after 2,000 years, generally, Christians are still agreed on the main things, right? So even though we have these different convictions about important things, it's not at all that they're not important, but divisions on baptism or eschatology or whatever it is, Christians for 2,000 years have agreed that Jesus is God and that there is only one God and he is a Trinity, and that Jesus became flesh or that the Son of God became flesh and died for our sins and he really resurrected. I find it just incredibly interesting and refreshing that after 2,000 years, pretty much, I mean, like if you don't agree with that, you're not a Christian, right? But we all agree on that. I talked to my Methodist, brother. He agrees on all that. I talked to my Lutheran brother. He agrees on it. I just find that really fascinating. So to the extent that then those institutional divisions are expressions of how we might coalesce with people who then on what we, I guess, could consider secondary, not unimportant, please don't hear that, but secondary, things that don't make a difference whether you're a Christian or not, but the kind of Christian you are. I think that can be really healthy and actually speaks to the diversity and the beauty of the global church. It's when we begin to take those secondary or tertiary things that don't make whether someone's really a Christian or not and make them whether someone's really a Christian or not. And so I'll just really say, just like the social justice, conversation. I'm not going to weigh in on a side here. I mean, if you follow me on social media, you probably know what side I weigh in on. But I have concerns on both sides, the wielding of your view as determining whether you're actually a Christian or not. So if you believe that the government can rightly have, can rightly address some of these grievances or what have you, you're not a Christian. Well, that's I don't agree with that. I think that's wrong. I think that's bad politics and bad governance. But I'm not going to say you're not a Christian. Like, how does that connect to your saving faith in Christ? And vice versa the other way. So we just denounce each other. So when our divisions are an expression of our diversity, I think they can be really healthy and reflect the beauty of Christ who, made us his body. But when we use them sort of against each other, that's when it becomes really unhealthy. And I'll just also say, like, the conversation of whether it's a gospel issue, to me, it's very notable how often people who are pointing out that others aren't preaching the gospel rarely are preaching the gospel themselves, at least in their public content. How is it that people come to love the gospel? It's not by being berated or chastised or condemned. And I think that goes for whatever side you find yourself on. Or I don't think there's just two sides. I think it's really a spectrum of different flavors and threads in these things. That's the last thing I'll say. It was a dangerous question. Thank you, brother.